Hello again, and welcome back to the Daily Bread Bible Study. I am Pastor Jeremy Ulrich. This is Ash Wednesday, as my dress is a little different, and we are looking at day 57 for Wednesday, February 26th, 2020, for Deuteronomy chapters 16 through 19. So let's look at Deuteronomy and see what Moses has to say for us, continuing in the different observances and the different rules and rituals. And we'll see a little bit about what Moses is going to talk about here today. So in Deuteronomy 16, we see that Moses reviews a few celebrations, including the Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Tabernacles or Booths, as it could be called. Notice that it is similar to Leviticus 23, and I didn't go over that in too much detail, but what I'll say about that here is that there are some notable omissions from the festivals that were mentioned in Leviticus 23, the offering of the first fruits, the festival of trumpets, and the big one, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Now, these three mentioned celebrations, that would be Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Booths, it says in Deuteronomy 16, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the Festival of Unleavened Bread, at the Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. This discussion, we could talk about the Passover, in which we did in greater detail, and that was on day 19 for Exodus chapter 12. In Deuteronomy 16:3, it mentions a little bit about the practice, saying, "You must not eat it with anything leavened. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt." So this bread of affliction, both the affliction of the Egyptians, but then also this bread of affliction that is not meant to be necessarily a happy, but more of a solemn type of bread. Definitely, it's not because you like the taste of this bread that you eat it. It's kind of an abnormal bread in a lot of ways. But you take this bread of affliction. This is also brings up a huge point that the Exodus is the central story for the people who are the Israelites at this day and time. It'll become a central story for the Jewish community as well too. And for us as Christians, it's not as central because we have, Jesus' death and resurrection becomes the central story of our day and time and the lens through which we look at God and the world around us. But for Moses and the Israelite community, the Exodus was the key story. It was the big way to shape all the days of their life, as it says there in chapter 16. The Festival of Weeks, again referenced in Leviticus 23. It's the offering of the first fruits, it's the Festival of Weeks, sorry. It's 50 days after the offering of the first fruits, which is, we get the Christian celebration of Pentecost and the story in the book of Acts for Pentecost comes from this festival. It says, "You have been slaves, but now you will get to keep the produce of the land for yourselves," which is very important. That in Egypt they didn't get to keep the produce. They were hired hands, slaves. Not hired hands. They were forced. They were slaves who did not get to keep the produce of the land that they tended to. But in Isaiah 65, that is one of the hopes for the Israelite community, is to be able to eat the fruit. And so as they come into the promised land and are then exiled there by Babylon, you hear the words of Isaiah, speaking about a future hope They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like in the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain. So this idea of not laboring in vain will be very much continued throughout the trajectory. And Moses will say, you will not labor in vain. God will be with you. God will bless you with all sorts of wine and food and a land flowing with milk and honey and all these rich foods that you will get to enjoy. And even when you're exiled, that this promise will still be the hope, is that you get to live in your house and with your property and to be at peace. We see Moses then talk about the festival of booths and tabernacles. It's the 7 days in tents or non-permanent structures as referenced in Leviticus 23. Moses says, you shall keep the festival of booths for 7 days when you have gathered in the produce of your threshing floor and your winepress, which goes back to this whole emphasis of you are still not being slaves. You have a plentiful harvest now. You get to keep that. You have not labored in vain. So give some back to God. So all of these 3 celebrations centering around remembering that they were slaves in Egypt. We see Deuteronomy 17 also not only we hear 16 prescribing rituals to observe and 17 prescribing rituals to be forbidden and taboo. The forbidden forms of worship that the Israelites were probably familiar with and may have been practicing themselves is to say that they should cast down the groves, the tree, or the Asherah, which apparently was a local false god worshipped in the Middle East. There are several references to the Asherah in the Bible. I have Judges 6:30. It says, the men of the town demanded that Joash bring out your son. He must die because he's broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. So this was something used in false worship, and I don't know much more about that, but extra biblical sources could be very helpful here. We look at the Levitical priest, and we see a little bit about how they would be used to mediate God's judgment for a case that was too puzzling for the judges, which makes me think back to Urim and Thummim, which was the form of divination that the high priest had access to. We talked about this on day 30. It's referenced in Leviticus chapter 8. So you could go back and hear that Daily Bread Bible study because they're all available. They're all recorded and kept on the Daily Bread study. They're kept there on the website. You can contact me and I'll get you links. You can see it on my YouTube page. There's the list for it. Day number 30 of the Daily Bread Bible study. So anyways, moving on. Let's look at the limitations of the royal authority. See, it says, Moses then addresses having a king. He says, the people will say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. They don't see this as a problem. And Moses says, God will allow you to have a king and appoint a king from your tribes. Then there are some strange requirements of the king, which seem to be contrary to King Solomon, as noted in his sins in 1 Kings 11. It says, you should not have too many horses. Connection to Egypt and the riders there of horses in Egypt. So don't be like Egypt. Then also remembering that the king should not have too many wives, which will turn away his heart, which is exactly what happens with King Solomon, as referenced in 1 Kings 11. then also advocated to not have too much gold or silver, which Solomon had a lot, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, which makes me think more of Jesus and the way that Jesus is called to be a suffering servant and one who suffers with us instead of suffering as somebody who is more is holier than we are. In Deuteronomy 18, we talk a little bit more about the Levites and the priests, saying that the Levites have no allotment of inheritance, and they may eat the sacrifices that are offered there, and they are chosen by God to stand and minister, and can do this anywhere among the national tribes of Israel. I will say this. This plays into the idea that we have in this day and time that my call is a national ordination. I serve locally here at Shepherd King, but yet I'm called to be a pastor in the ELCA throughout the whole United States, and that this Levitical code was for a national ordination, not just a local ordination to be someone who could operate within a small confined area. So anyways, moving on, we talk a little bit more about idolatry and saying in Deuteronomy 18 that these forms of worship that are probably practiced by other nations and may even be practiced by some of the Israelites, that they shall get rid of these practices starting in Deuteronomy 18, verse 10. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or a daughter pass through fire, or who practice divination as a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or spirits, or one who seeks oracles from the dead. For whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord. It is because of such abhorrent practices that the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You must remain completely loyal to the Lord your God. So I see this less as contradicting the Urim and the Thummim we just talked about that the high priest had, which were to consult God. It was more about trusting in God alone, and in fact, through the offering of sacrifices and the rituals in the tabernacle, that you could remain loyal to God and still get these answers kind of solved that you would go see soothsayers or sorcerers for. So you would consult God through the tabernacle worship and not through these extra outside of the community ways. Moses then mentions there will be a new prophet raised up like Moses, and that you can evaluate the success of a prophet by the things that will take place or prove true in Deuteronomy 18:22. Now, of course, you have to be skeptical because, like Jesus mentioned, many will come saying, I am, or come in the name of Jesus and show signs and wonders, but the signs themselves over time can show God's presence, but if it's flashy and momentary, then it can be a challenge. But moving on and closing with Deuteronomy 19, we see Moses discuss 3 different laws concerning the cities of refuge, which is a repeat from Numbers 35. Numbers 35 goes into a little bit more detail about it, but it says here and clarifies that there would be 3 east of the Jordan, where the land that they have already conquered at this point. And then if they happen to conquer the promised land, ask for 3 more to be west of the Jordan in the lands that the Israelites will come to inhabit. We, sitting in this perspective, know, in fact, that will happen. The Moses' second law he discussed is about, it's a brief law about not changing the property lines, the boundaries set up between the ancestors of the generations when they are going to set for themselves the boundaries of the different areas of the tribes. And so if you move the line, right, that will be dishonest and cheating, and it will be taking advantage of your neighbor, and so is not called to do that. And then in the third, he's restating the law for multiple witnesses, saying that there needs to be multiple individuals instead of one to accuse somebody, because oftentimes the consequence would be death. And so you cannot put somebody to death through one individual in their testimony. You need multiple witnesses to confirm that that is the case. So we'll see that with Jesus. That is why multiple witnesses are brought in against Jesus to try and convict him so he could be put to death. But anyways, I hope you have a respectful Ash Wednesday and be able to celebrate our journey into Lent. And thank you for joining for the Daily Bread Bible Study. I hope you would be interested in making this a part of your regular routine, even in Lent as well.